Hello and welcome to the CNBC TV 18 special broadcast. We're coming to you from Washington, D.C., right outside Capitol Hill, White House, where President Trump is going to be meeting with Prime Minister Modi in a few hours from now. Joining us to discuss an issue that could possibly be raised, the U.S. would certainly want to raise it, or at least some U.S. congressmen would certainly want this issue to be raised by President Trump with Prime Minister Modi, is the issue around intellectual property. Joining us today to take that conversation forward is Laura Kreis, Director of Strategy and Communication for the Global Intellectual Property Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Laura, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. You know, just ahead of this visit, and this is not unusual. We've seen U.S. lawmakers write to President Trump, and I'm just quoting from that letter, saying that while Indian businesses continue to benefit from U.S. open markets, India has failed to eliminate or even address concretely multiple trade and investment barriers that have been the focus of recent bilateral and multilateral fora. Isn't this a tad exaggerated, given the fact that today India has seen its highest FDI inflow?
So I think when you look at the environment right now in the U.S. and everything that the current administration is focusing on, the Trump administration has been very clear from the beginning of its start that it has a new focus on intellectual property enforcement with regard to any country that we're dealing with bilateral relationships, multilateral relationships. So that's an area of focus for every country that we're dealing with. They're reviewing multiple agreements right now to make sure that we have strong enough IP enforcement. With regard to India, some of the issues have been long-standing or continued conversations. And these are the kinds of issues that you're seeing being raised by top trade lawmakers now, and also being verified by the White House.
You know, there is a working group on IP. In fact, the former U.S. ambassador to India, Richard Verma, in an interview to me had said that on the issue of intellectual property, there was actually convergence between India and the U.S. What is the specific concern that you have with India's IP laws?
So I think what we've seen, and you might point to the IPR policy that was put in place last year, we've seen some movement in the right direction in terms of thinking the right way, in terms of increasing IP standards. We've seen some positive steps forward in terms of recognizing there's a need. But the actual legislation, the actual laws, the structure that needs to be in place to give the business community the stable environment it needs has not quite happened yet. There are still gaps, the same gaps that existed in India's law before the IPR policy we still see today. When you look at specifically what that is, you look at patentability restrictions across the board. One of the examples of that is with regard to computer-related inventions and software. Those are huge barriers to industry, and we would also. So
is it less farmer-related now, the concerns that you have?
I mean, I think when you look across the board, we at the Global Intellectual Property Center look at all forms of IP. You definitely patentability with regard to pharmaceuticals, biopharmaceuticals. You see it with software, but also we see issues with copyright, and camcording continues to be an issue. Piracy continues to be an issue. So those are things that we think that the Indian government still has opportunity to put some laws in place that move them forward, and also set up a better environment for U.S. relations.
And I keep going back to the 301 report that comes out, and India continues to be ranked very low on that. And the view from the Indian perspective is that perhaps there isn't an appreciation of how much has really changed in India. And I go back to my point about why are large companies, U.S. companies like GE, Honeywell, setting up R&D facilities, not manufacturing facilities, R&D facilities in India, if they were so concerned about IP-related issues.
Well, I can't speak to, the individual decisions that individual companies are making.
I'm just saying that that's an example of the change in the business climate, obviously, which encourages people to make big ticket investments in R&D specifically.
What I can tell you is, working with the U.S. business community and with companies that are operating all around the world, what we hear and what we see in terms of what they value in an environment are steady, stable laws that are in place to protect intellectual property, and they still feel like there are gaps there that are contributing to this uncertain environment for many businesses.
Since we're talking about IP, there's this executive order which is leaked, at least in some parts of the media, and a lot of people are reacting to that. MSF has in fact put out a statement, Doctors Without Borders, saying that this should be an issue that Prime Minister Modi should take up with President Trump. He said India should not be pressured into issuing compulsory licenses. The US is trying to seek more concessions by way of extending patent terms beyond 20 years, lowering standards for grants of patents, etc. And India must not succumb to this kind of pressure. What's your response to the leaked executive order?
Are you referring to the executive order that
on pharma specifically?
You know, we're looking at that. Anytime you look at something that's going to improve intellectual property protections, we want to see those put in place. In many countries, there's not 20 years protection, and we would argue that there is some room for improvement. There's also a need where you've seen maybe negative actions taken, such as compulsory license. We also see a need for governments to step forward and reassure the industry and
But hasn't the Indian government given enough assurance, and even as far as the issue of compulsory license is concerned? And even in dealing with patentability, when the matter has gone to courts, in fact, it's the patent holder in most cases that's won in India.
I think when you're looking at Indian law, and there's still gaps that do not assure that that's no longer off the table. And you do hear a lot of rhetoric, not always from the government, sometimes from activist forces and other groups that are weighing into the conversation. But you do still see and hear a lot that gives industry pause, that gives businesses pause. And these are businesses, by the way, that are actually eager to invest in India. When you go back to the global, we put out a ranking system every year that looks at the global IP environment. India is one that many businesses see as a prime opportunity, but for many of them, they see it as a missed opportunity because when you line up and look at the environment, you look at the protections for patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, a number of IP factors, you see that India still does not have the same kinds of protections in place that many other countries do. So it's also about how competitive does India want to be in a world market. India, in many ways, presents this large opportunity for companies operating in multiple countries. And I do think you would see even more investment, even more innovative investment, and the kinds of socioeconomic benefits that go along with that. Job growth, higher wages, access to technologies, access to medicines. These are the positive correlations we see in environments that have stronger IP environments.
I'm glad that you brought up the survey and you brought up the index, because again, this is a problem that people have with the way that India is judged on that. Because why would a Microsoft invest and set up its second largest based outside of the US in India? And there are several other companies who are putting down big-ticket investments, hiring and spending money on R&D, not just using India as a back office, so to speak. So what is it that the survey fails to recognize and appreciate about India?
And I guess I would turn that around and say, what is it that Prime Minister Modi is trying to accomplish with Make in India and Invest in India? I think if you look at India's current environment, if it's happy with the kinds of foreign direct investment that it's seeing, the kinds of venture capital coming into the country, the kinds of high quality, high paying jobs that it's able to provide for its citizens, then you don't need to worry about where you rank on our index. I think India has shown that it has an interest in really charging forward and seizing the opportunity that it has to grow. I think there's a mutual interest between the U.S. and India to seize on that as well. And I think this opportunity, this meeting here today, being able to address some of the issues, some of the barriers that have stood in place of that between our two countries, between the U.S. and India, with this new administration, I think there's a really great opportunity here to hit reset and to maybe put some policies in place where there are still gaps in Indian law.
So anything specific that you believe India can do to bridge this deficit that you spoke of?
Sure. Again, I think talking about broad patentability issues, what's able to be patented, restrictions and exemptions. When you look at software, you can see all of the many ways that software in and of itself across many industries and many types of technologies. It's changing our world at a rapid pace. There's no doubt that that's innovative. And when you're tying software to a hardware product, that severely restricts what you're able to, the innovative products that you're able to patent and then spur more innovation. So I think that's certainly a place where actually India had taken some positive steps forward. We saw them put in place some good guidelines back about a year or so ago, and then they came back and last year put in place some other guidelines that were not, that we felt like actually took a few steps back. So I think addressing those software guidelines specifically would be helpful. Also with regard to camcording and piracy, we see, India still leads the world there, and we think that the government can step in, put some policies in place, and crack down better on that in a way that, that's even a harmful thing for India's own Bollywood industry. I think it's something like $3 billion a year they lose because of these kinds of activities. So we see IP investment as something that's positive for the U.S.-India bilateral relationship. We also see it as something that's positive for India and in and of itself that will help India meet its own goals of make in India and invest in India.
Do you feel confident that this is going to be something that the Trump administration takes up with Prime Minister Modi on this visit?
Well, I think yesterday you saw high-level leaders on Capitol Hill, the top trade leaders on Capitol Hill, sending, their strong recommendations for him to raise those. In response, a White House official who was giving press availability said we are absolutely planning to raise concerns with intellectual property. U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer was on Capitol Hill this week testifying before Congress. Several times he affirmed that IP remains a concern. These are going to be issues that he discusses, or the administration discusses, with Prime Minister Modi. So we feel like there's certainty that they will continue to be issues that are raised. We hope that they're seen as new opportunities again to hit reset with a new administration, and that we'll see some progress moving forward.
Well, we don't know whether this will finally be taken up or not, but thank you very much for joining us and articulating for us the concerns that the U.S. continues to have with respect to the issues around patents and IP.
And also the opportunities that we see, given the right steps forward. I want to make sure your audience understands that there is much interest in continuing to invest increasingly in India. These are just the standards that many businesses would like to see.
All right, Laura, thanks very much for your time, and thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. With that, it is time for us to take a quick break, but when we return, our conversations will continue on our special coverage of Modi meets Trump.